They laughed at it, they mocked it. Some even called it the world's first rolling stovepipe. But here's the shocker. That weird-looking motorcycle from 1923, the Nimbus Stovepipe, didn't just roll into history as a joke. It actually carried secrets so far ahead of its time that even today motorcycle engineers look back at it in disbelief. Picture it, the early 1920s. Roads were rough. Motorcycles were basically bicycles with engines bolted on, and most riders were shaking their teeth out on single-cylinder machines. Then, out of Denmark, not Germany, not America, but Denmark of all places, comes this strange, boxy-looking motorcycle built by a vacuum cleaner company. Yes, a vacuum cleaner company. If that doesn't grab your curiosity, I don't know what will. And here's the kicker. The Nimbus didn't just ride differently, it rewrote the rules. Inline-4 engine, shaft drive, a frame that doubled as the fuel tank. It was so odd, so unusual, and yet so innovative that the world didn't quite know what to make of it. Before I take you into the hidden secrets of this stovepipe on wheels, do me a favour, smash that subscribe button like you're smashing a cockroach that just ran across your kitchen floor. You don't hesitate, you don't think twice, you go all in. That's exactly how deep we're about to go into this story. Because the Nimbus stovepipe may have looked ridiculous, but under its skin, it was a silent revolution. And trust me, you're going to want to stick around, because the weirdest secret is still coming later in this video. Most motorcycle stories begin with passionate tinkerers in sheds or big factories trying to outdo each other. Nimbus? Their story begins with Fisker and Nielsen, a Danish company famous for making vacuum cleaners called the Nilfisk. So imagine this. A company whose biggest success was sucking up dust suddenly decides, hey, let's make motorcycles. That's like if Dyson suddenly released a superbike tomorrow. People would laugh, but deep down you'd want to see what they built. And in 1919, just after World War I, Fisker and Nielsen released their first Nimbus motorcycle. It was unusual, it was bold, and it set the stage for the 1923 model that would shock the entire industry. But here's the funny part. Because of the company's vacuum cleaner history, riders started calling their bikes nicknames like the vacuum cleaner on wheels and later the stovepipe. Little did they know this stovepipe design wasn't a gimmick. It was a brilliant solution hiding in plain sight. And speaking of that stovepipe, what made it so odd was actually its greatest strength. Most motorcycles back then had steel tube frames, simple, easy, and let's be honest, not very strong. Nimbus said, "Nah, let's make this look like something out of a hardware store." They built the backbone of the bike out of steel strips, riveted together to form a big, boxy frame. People thought it looked ugly, industrial, almost like you'd see it under a sink rather than under a rider. But here's the genius. That frame was incredibly rigid, which gave the Nimbus amazing stability on the rough dirt roads of the 1920s, and it gets even better. That hollow backbone frame doubled as the fuel tank. No need for a big clunky tank slapped on top. The fuel literally flowed inside the frame itself. This was decades ahead of its time. Most motorcycles back then wasted space. Nimbus turned the entire spine of the bike into something functional. Now, was it practical? Sort of. If you dented your frame, well, congratulations. You also dented your gas tank. But it was such a wild idea that even modern engineers still respect it today. But the frame wasn't the only futuristic thing about the stovepipe, because what they put inside it was even more shocking. Let's talk about power. While most motorcycles in 1923 were rocking tiny single-cylinder or maybe twin-cylinder engines, Nimbus went full mad scientist. They dropped in a 746cc inline-4 engine. That's right, a four-cylinder bike when everyone else was still figuring out how to make two cylinders work. This engine put out about 10.5 horsepower at 2,200 revolutions per minute. Now, I know, 10 horsepower today sounds like something you'd find in a lawnmower, but in 1923, that was enough to make the Nimbus one of the fastest motorcycles in Denmark, capable of hitting 70 kilometers per h, 43 miles per hour. On rough dirt tracks and cobbled roads, that was flying. And here's the clever part. The engine had a fan-assisted cooling system. Other motorcycles of the time would overheat if you got stuck in traffic or rode too long. The Nimbus just kept chugging along. Riders loved how smooth and quiet it was compared to the bone-rattling machines of its day. In fact, It was so smooth that people joked it felt like cheating compared to other bikes. Imagine everyone bouncing around on jackhammers while you're gliding past like you're on a magic carpet. But Nimbus didn't stop at the engine. They hid another piece of genius in the drivetrain, something that most riders today take for granted. Chains. In the 1920s, every motorcycle ran on chains. Chains that snapped, chains that rusted, chains that demanded oil every 5 minutes. If you were a rider back then, you basically carried a can of grease in your pocket. Nimbus said, "Forget the mess." Instead, they built the Stovepipe with a shaft drive system. No chains, no grease, no headaches, just smooth, reliable power straight to the rear wheel. Now think about how wild that was. Even today, shaft drives are mostly found on premium touring bikes like BMWs. Nimbus was doing it in 1923. That's like showing up to a horse and buggy race in a Tesla. And here's the kicker. The shaft drive made the Nimbus so reliable that police forces and the Danish army later adopted them in huge numbers. You could throw these bikes into almost any condition and they'd just keep going. But that reliability didn't stop people from making fun of how it looked. After all, no matter how clever the engineering, you still had to explain to your friends that you were riding a stovepipe down the street. Yet, somehow, that quirky design ended up shaping an entire culture. The Nimbus earned a reputation not just for its performance, but for its personality. Riders gave it nicknames, painted it with wild colours, and turned it into something of a cult machine. And let's be honest, if your motorcycle looks like a giant piece of plumbing, you might as well own it. Some owners leaned into the joke, painting stovepipe designs or decorating it to look like kitchen appliances. Imagine rolling into a 1920s Danish cafe with that. You're either the coolest guy in town or the one everyone's laughing at. Maybe both. But behind the laughs, riders respected it. The bike was durable, stable and smooth. It became a long-distance favourite. Danish police used it. The Danish army used it well into the 1950s. That's 3 decades of service from a funny-looking stovepipe. And here's the secret. Even though people mocked it, they kept buying it. Which begs the question, what stopped Nimbus from taking over the motorcycle world? Here's where the story takes a twist. Despite all its innovations, the Nimbus stovepipe didn't dominate globally. Why? First, production was tiny. Between 1919 and 1928, only about 1,252 stovepipes were built. That's nothing compared to the mass-produced motorcycles flooding out of America and Germany. Nimbus just didn't have the scale. Second, looks matter. Riders in France, Britain and the US weren't ready to accept a motorcycle that looked like a home appliance. It didn't scream freedom or speed. It screamed stovepipe. So while the bike was brilliant, it was also a victim of its own weirdness. In 1928, production of the stovepipe ended. But Nimbus wasn't done. They later created the Nimbus Type C, nicknamed the Bumblebee, which carried the brand into the 1950s. But the stovepipe, that became the cult classic. And today, it's the one collectors drool over. If you find a Nimbus stovepipe today, congratulations, you've struck gold. Because with just over 1,000 ever built, they're extremely rare. Surviving models can fetch tens of thousands of dollars at auctions. And here's the cool part. Many of the ones that survived are still running. That's how tough these bikes were. Restorers love them, museums display them, and collectors guard them like treasure. So, the motorcycle once mocked as a stovepipe has now become a crown jewel. Funny how history works, isn't it? But here's the final secret. The one that shows why the Nimbus stovepipe deserves way more respect than it ever got. The Nimbus stovepipe wasn't just a motorcycle. It was a philosophy. It proved that sometimes being weird is the only way to push forward. While other manufacturers played it safe, Nimbus dared to be different. It dared to build a backbone frame that doubled as a fuel tank. It dared to put an inline-4 in a time when that was crazy. It dared to build a shaft drive decades before anyone else took it seriously. And maybe that's why it still captures our imagination today. Because when you see a Nimbus stovepipe, you're not just looking at a motorcycle, you're looking at the future disguised as the past. So there it is. The 1923 Nimbus Stovepipe, a motorcycle born from a vacuum cleaner company, mocked for looking like kitchenware, but secretly packed with genius. From its inline-four engine to its shaft drive, from its quirky frame to its legendary durability, it was decades ahead of its time. It didn't conquer the world, but it left behind a legacy that still inspires today. And maybe that's the biggest lesson of all. Never underestimate the weird ones, because sometimes the strangest ideas are the ones that change history. If you enjoyed this deep dive into forgotten automotive history, hit that subscribe button for more shocking stories. Because trust me, we've only scratched the surface.